right, good morning. Welcome, welcome. Does anyone else have the same mentality that I do? Like you go outside and it's winter and you're shoveling. You're like, okay, it's January. This is going to be the last snowfall of the year, the last time I have to shovel. And then it's February and you're like, okay, this is the 30th time I've shoveled. And so I did that again this week as we got, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches of snow. I was saying in my head that this is the last time. And I know it's probably not true. So, but I think that, and I hope that. I want to tell you a story about a plan that I once had when I was a kid that didn't really come to fruition. So I have a friend, and his name or did have a friend. I'm still Facebook friends with him, if you can call that a friendship. But we grew up together. We were probably best friends growing up. His name is David. And if you went to Shiloh, don't worry, this is not the skunk story, but it is the same friend. It is David. And we were just, we like to think of ourselves, I don't know, we were probably like 9, 10. And we like to think of ourselves as like real men. We played, not cops and robbers, but we play like army guys all the time. And David actually went into the military. He was a Marine for a long time. And so anyways, this day he came over to the house, and I have a small backyard, and we started building the fort with sticks and with leaves, and we were picking up all these sticks everywhere. We got these leaves. We found these big leaves somewhere in the yard. I don't even know where we found them, but they were, at least I remember them that way. They were pretty big leaves. And so we made this fort awesome, right? And we were like, oh, let's use leaves, and we'll make it waterproof. So then we got the idea that we were going to sleep in the fort overnight that night. And we did not get to sleep in the fort because my mother had a wise sense about her and did not allow us to do that. But we had the plan to do that, and our plan didn't work out. You ever have plans that don't work out? Something that you think is a really good idea, and then it just doesn't come to fruition. I want to read in John chapter 16. It says, his disciples said, lo, now you are speaking plainly and are not using a figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and have no need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you came from God. Jesus answered them, do you now believe? Behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. And so, in reading this passage and thinking about it, I came to the realization that you've always got, they call it in verse 33, tribulation, but we've always got stuff in our life, right? And then Jesus says that I've overcome the world, so he has a plan. And he tells us to take courage, so we have a choice to make. So there's always going to be stuff in our lives. God is always going to have a plan, and we always have a choice to make. But have you ever noticed that that when you're in the stuff of life, that it can feel like we're all alone, like we've maybe lost a connection. Maybe the connection that we lost was with some friends or with others, but a lot of times we think like God is so far away and so distant. If you could see behind me, we have a mission statement on the wall, but you can't see it because we have a curtain up now and we have some other things back there. But our mission statement here at New Testament is to connect people to God, his presence, his power, and his promises. And so the way we've set up everything here and tried to set up a lot of our systems here at church is to connect you. And it's not just to connect you to God, but we want you to be healthy enough to reach out and help to connect others as well to God and to his power and to his promises. So that's why we have things like discover groups. We have the cafe after service. We have the basketball court, and I'm not a basketball player, but I'm tall. And I had an uncle growing up that always, every time we went over to his house, he didn't live that close, but every time we went over to his house, he always asked me if I could palm a basketball yet. And I was like, dude, no. Like, I still can't. Like, you'd think that with as tall as I am, that I would be able to palm a basketball. I can't do it. But there's a basketball court out there. There's kids out there all throughout the summer where we can connect with them. And I challenge you, if you are a basketball player, to go out there and connect with the community, connect with the kids that come and play. We have women's groups that are constantly doing events. I think there's a craft night coming up. I'm not sure exactly when it is, but in the next couple weeks they're making like a flower pot or something like that. So there's a craft night, and we've got many other ways and avenues for us to connect with each other. But the problem is sometimes there's these events in life that make it so hard to connect that that we just feel so distant. I remember coming home from college in the summers, and even after I graduated, and I went to two schools, so it happened a few times. But I would come home, and it's like even over the summers, and I knew I was going back, and it's like just this depression would sink in because I hadn't started a job. I didn't really have a plan of what to do, and if I did, I didn't know if it was going to come about. But I would come home from college, and I just felt this complete loss of relationships because I had all my friends at school, and we would hang out constantly, and I had some small, jobs here and there during school, but for the most part, I was either in class or I was hanging out with my friends. And then I'd come home, and now you're sitting all alone. You're by yourself. You're either in your apartment. I lived with my parents all throughout school. So we lose a sense of purpose, right? When we lose that connection, when we lose relationships, and when we don't have a plan. And we experience a feeling of isolation. Does anyone know who Michael Collins is? If I say the name Michael Collins. So Michael Collins is an astronaut, and if I say the name Apollo 11, I'm sure you would all recognize that. So Michael Collins was the guy that Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to the moon, the first man landing on the moon. And Michael Collins was the guy that got the job of staying up in the command module while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin went down and landed on the moon. And so he is the first man to experience this complete isolation because as his vessel, as his command module is orbiting the moon, he has to go around the dark side of the moon. And so 55 minutes elapse, and he is the furthest human away from anyone ever that had ever existed. And he wrote this when that had happened. He said, "I am now truly alone and absolutely alone from any known life. I am it." Sometimes we can experience that feeling of isolation and loneliness in life, right? We're the most connected society of all time, but in reality, I think we're probably the least connected socially, because we can post things on Facebook and we can go on Instagram and everybody can see what we had for lunch for the past months, but we really are lacking that personal connection to somebody. It's a connection that we have in today's society that's so distant, but we feel it gives us the sense that we're really connecting to people when we're in reality isolated. And loneliness can be experienced in many different situations in life, many different areas. We can experience rejection or grief. Self-centeredness can also be a a type of loneliness when we focus only on ourselves. We we can be married. I can be married to Lori, and if I'm not spending time with her, and if I'm not focused on her, I have a really lonely marriage. Sometimes we fall into that trap that no one understands me or gets me. I'm the only one that's going through this and experiencing this. We have a desperation to stay connected. Michael Collins, as the moon lander was descending down to the moon, he I think some fear maybe overcame him, and as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were descending to the moon, he says this: "Keep talking to me, guys." I find that just incredibly sobering to think that that is uh, the human emotion, the human desire to stay connected, and that fear of being alone. Matthew 28, uh, Jesus says, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And in Romans chapter 8, it says, "For I am convinced that neither life, nor death, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing, the moon, will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord." See, Michael Collins was his biggest fear, he said, was that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin wouldn't come back from the moon, and that he had a plan. He trusted in NASA's plan to get him back to Earth, but he was going to be going back alone. And he said he'd be a marked man for the rest of his life, and he knew it. So he was going to return to 7 billion people on the planet, but if he came back alone, he was going to be alone the rest of his life. Now, thankfully, we all know the story that didn't happen. It's interesting, though, to note that if you look up some of the documentaries on Apollo 11 and some of the things, it was pretty close to not being a success. They had quite a few course corrections that needed to be made. And I think sometimes that's true. When our plans don't always go as we expected, we perceive that as failure. But it's not really failure, it's a course correction. So in looking again at verse 33, how can we stay connected? Because Jesus says again, we're always going to have stuff. We're going to have tribulation in life. But he said to take courage, and he said that I have overcome the world. So he has a plan, and we can choose to walk in that plan. So Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." The plan doesn't always look like we expected it to. If I could I share a pretty embarrassing story with you? so, so, so we have friends that live in Rochester, but they have a cottage, and this cottage is on the Thousand Islands, and it's a cottage, so it's old and it's not great. The plumbing isn't up to par. They have a leach field, and the leach field needs to be cleaned every few years, otherwise it gets backed up, and the toilet doesn't work like it's supposed to. So I knew this going in to the weekend where we were going, that this was going to be a problem. And so I intentionally made a plan that we were going to go out to eat, and I was going to use the facilities at this restaurant rather than worry about having an issue in the cottage. But it's a good plan, right? Well, the good news is I did not have a mishap or any issues at the cottage. But the problem was there was this restaurant. And so I think it was, I don't know, Friday or Saturday morning, we decided we're going to go out to breakfast. We go to this local diner, like local hole in the wall, backwoods diner where the tables are, folding tables that are set up, folding chairs. They're pretty much only open, I think, for breakfast. They might have done some brunch or something too. Um, but then there's as you walk in, there's the counter. So I'm walking into the restaurant. Here's the countertop where you would pay, and then here is the dining room with tables. Just around to the left side of the counter where you would pay, in through a doorway is the kitchen, and just before the doorway to the kitchen is the doorway to the restroom. So I thought, perfect. We'll order food. I'll go do what I need to do in the bathroom. See, where I failed was I didn't check to make sure that their toilet was working properly. And this was not my fault, and except that I didn't make sure that the toilet was functioning the way it was supposed to. So, so I'm in the bathroom. I flush the toilet, and then this panic overcomes me because it is not working as it should. And quick thinking, oh great, there's a plunger there. Well, if you know anything about water displacement, when you put the plunger in and the water is still filling the bowl, the water comes out of the bowl. So much so that there was a stream. Now, the water was clear. It wasn't brown. It wasn't yellow. It looked like it could have come from a leaky faucet in the sink. And so anyways, this water starts to flow out underneath the bathroom door, which is essentially right into the dining room, because it's all linoleum floor. So I'm like, oh, shoot. And I grab the paper towel, and I'm trying to throw it on the floor. Now, at this point, thankfully, the toilet did stop, and I'm pretty sure it went down, but regardless, it had stopped overflowing. So this actually didn't happen right after we ordered food. This was after we had finished our meal. And so, me not thinking too much of it, I'm like, okay, well, a little water made it out the door, but, no big deal. Hopefully nobody really noticed. Have you ever seen the movie Ace Ventura? When he goes into the bathroom and, like, blows up, and then he comes out, he's like, whoo, do not go in there. So... So, so I come out of the bathroom, and I've got about 30 eyes staring directly at me, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm like, oh, geez. The 6 friends that I were with have somehow disappeared. Did they pay the bill? Did they leave me here? And so, me being, the good Christian that I am, kind of looked around the room, didn't see my friends, assumed they went out to the car because of the situation, just kind of looked at everybody and went, well, and walked right out the door. Trusting Him, trusting God's plan, means that sometimes we have to make ourselves vulnerable. And vulnerability is scary because it opens us up to what we perceive as failure. But just like the astronauts that had some issues with their missions and needed a course correction, failure is sometimes allowed for God to give us a course correction. So what I call it this: we need to have a pass-through mentality, meaning that failure is just a pass-through. I'm not stopping here. This isn't a stop along the journey. This isn't a pit stop. I'm just passing through. And you look at some examples in the Bible where God's plan was being fulfilled, but the characters in the Bible, if it were any of us, we would have been losing our minds and just completely beside ourselves. You think of Joseph and his brothers. So this is a guy, right? He gets a dream from God that his brothers are going to bow down to him. And so he came up with a plan in his own head and decided, hello, I'm going to tell my brothers that they're all going to serve me. Well, that was a bad idea. And so, you think of Joseph and his brothers, and Joseph sold into slavery, thrown down in a well and left for dead, and thrown into prison a few times and everything else. But the plan of God was still fulfilled in his life. See, if you just look at the failures in Joseph's life, and stop there, you're thinking that there's no way this is going to even come to fruition or happen. You think of Daniel in the lion's den. Could you imagine Daniel serving God, doing what he's supposed to do, and then he gets thrown into a lion's den? Or I think of just isolation and people that total sense of being alone, that nobody is with you. And I think of the story of David and Goliath. The whole army is there, and they're like, hey, you got this. We're not going up there. You go for it. All alone facing Goliath, the giant of the Philistines. We have some people today that we don't see them as failures, but they weren't always as successful as we see them today. And there's a whole list. If you Google this, there is a list of it's just incredibly long of people that have worked their way through failure to become the success that they are today. And just a few of these: Steve Jobs, he was fired from Apple at one point. He created Apple. He was the founder of Apple, and Apple fired him. Now, this was before Apple had the huge success that it had in, what was it, the late 90s maybe, or early 2000s, when they kind of took off again. And then they hired him back, and that's where Apple got their success, is that Steve Jobs came back to the company that he founded. You know, Bill Gates was a Harvard dropout. He have you ever heard of the business called Traf-O-Data? No? That was a co-owned business of Bill Gates. Obviously unsuccessful. At 31 years old, he was a self-made billionaire. But we don't see the failures that he experienced along the way. Albert Einstein couldn't speak fluently until he was 9. He had a rebellious nature that got him got him expelled from school. He was rejected and couldn't get into Zurich Polytechnic School. Albert Einstein. Abraham Lincoln failed in business in 1931, had a nervous breakdown in 1836. And he ran for president in 1856, but was defeated. He's now known as one of the greatest presidents of all time. See, success isn't measured by what you're doing, it's measured by what you're becoming or who you're becoming. I'm going to say that again. Success isn't measured by what you're doing, it's measured by who you are becoming. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says we are being transformed. Being transformed. But again, it's not about what we're doing, it's about getting a revelation of who Jesus is. I always think the story of the crippled man at the pool of Bethesda. And, Jesus comes to him and the man says, I've been here a good chunk of my life, a very long time, waiting for somebody, because the pool of Bethesda was a pool that the angels would come and the waters would stir, and the first one into the pool would get a healing, would get the healing that they're seeking. So this man, a crippled man, has been waiting there for years and years and years. And so Jesus comes by and says, what's your story? What's going on? And he says, well, I've been waiting here for a long time, and I've got no one to help me into the pool. So putting myself in the mentality and the thought process of the crippled man, I'm thinking, okay, if I'm the crippled man, Jesus is going to help me into the pool and stir the water and everything else. And Jesus says, nope, I got a better plan. A much simpler plan, a plan that is a lot easier than trying to get into that pool. He simply says, pick up your mat and walk. See, the crippled man didn't get into the pool. He got a revelation of who Jesus is. 1 Peter 5, 6, and 7 says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. So here it comes down to the choice. If we want to stay connected, we've got a choice to take courage. We've got to choose to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God and cast our anxiety on him. Imagine if the Israelites, when they were wandering in the desert, had chosen to humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. I think about the story sometimes of the Exodus where, God delivers them from the hands of the Egyptians, and then they're in the desert and they're complaining, oh, well, we don't have anything to eat. And then, God opens up the sea. Oh, we don't have anything to drink. Moses hits the rock. There's water everywhere. They see miracle after miracle after miracle. And each time they still fall into that trap of questioning God's plan. And I'm reading the story, from time to time, and almost every time I read it, I'm thinking to myself, man, how dumb are these people? Like, dude, you just walk through the lake on dry ground. There's a pillar of fire, and there's a pillar of cloud. Like, why are you struggling to get this concept? And then you look at your own life, and you're like, geez, I do the exact same thing. Every time God pulls you through something, the very next challenge, the very next struggle, the very next tribulation or stuff in your life causes you to completely lose connection. Sometimes, and I do this myself too, you blame God. You're like, where in the heck are you, Lord? And then it's like, oh, well, I'm just an Israelite that can't remember what I had for breakfast. And I don't remember the last time God saw me through something, even though it was probably, 30 minutes ago. See, we've got to avoid like Michael Collins said, I am it. That's a powerful statement. I am it. We've got to avoid that mentality, the I am it mentality, because isolation causes incorrect thinking. Have you ever talked to somebody and they say something to you and then you walk away and you're like, holy cow, why were they such a jerk? And then you're stewing on it and you're thinking about it and it's going over and over in your head and in your mind, and then it just it balloons into this crazy big, like, thing. And if you would just go talk to the person, they would be like, "What are you talking about? I didn't mean that at all. Like, I was trying to give you a compliment." See, the byproduct of isolation is that we end up retreating from what God has for us. Here's another principle that I think is important, and that we had talked about briefly, and how we as a church try to provide avenues and ways that we can connect with each other and connect with God, and that is the time is money principle. You've heard the statement, time is money. Well, time is valuable in the spiritual sense and in the business place, and the more time we spend with Him and with others, the less isolated we will be, the less isolated we will feel, and the better we can embrace what we already have inside of us. So Romans chapter 8, verse 11 says, "But the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you. He who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through His Spirit who dwells in you." Isn't that amazing? The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells in us. One of my favorite verses is John 14, verse 12. Jesus says that greater works than I do, you will do. That's the power that we have inside of us. If we, like the crippled man, can catch that revelation of who Jesus is, Bill Johnson said this. He said, "Your victory begins the day you stop being impressed by the size of your problem." Right? Because we have the thought process like, "Oh, I was just thrown into the lion's den. What's going to happen now?" And we think that the lions are going to just eat us to pieces. Or we have a dream like Joseph did, and we know that it was a dream from God, and we can't see how it's going to come to pass because we're in chains, we're in prison, we're in a well. I mean, imagine how far away that is. How far from being thrown into a well to being the top dog during a famine, and having that much responsibility, and your family actually does come, and your dream is fulfilled that was given to you. But just think about that. I mean, how far away is Joseph from that dream being fulfilled to him being in a well? See, sometimes we think we have a mentality where we think that we've alienated ourselves from God. We think that we've done too much, or that we're not able to make that connection with God. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 21, it says, "And you who were once alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now He has reconciled." You know what the key word in there is, the key phrase in that verse? "And you were once alienated and enemies in your mind." See, we were never really alienated from God. I think about, like, in Genesis chapter 3, the first, the fall of man. And who you look back in Genesis, who's the one hiding in the garden? God's the one looking for us. And Adam and Eve are the ones hiding. So we've got to get that revelation. We've got to get that trust in Him that He is going to do what He said He is going to do. that he will never leave us or forsake us, and that he's not our enemy. Because we're always going to have stuff. See, here's what kind of stinks. This is like the secret of life, right? There's stuff, there's a plan, and then we've got choices. But there's always going to be the stuff. And so we move from stuff to plan. We make a choice to trust God, and then guess what? We're right back into more stuff. Doesn't that kind of stink? But I've come to the place where I'm trying to change my mentality. That's actually what the word repentance means. It's metanoia, which is to change your mind. And I'm trying to, and I'm nowhere near there yet, but I'm trying to change my thinking, and that whenever there's a challenge in life, or whenever there's a stuff or a tribulation that comes up, I'm trying to be joyful about it, because I know that it's another situation where God can prove himself faithful, and that I can see the plan of his unfold in my life. Jill, if you want to come up, we're going to close. Again, John 16:33, we read it in the beginning. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. See, when we're connected to God, we can see through the stuff that he has a plan, and we have a choice to walk in that plan. Can you trust God enough to get you through the tribulations of life and still carry out his plan? Can you put your faith in him, that even when you're in the lion's den, you know that he's going to show himself faithful? Because he's done it in the past, and he's going to do it again. If you're struggling today, and you're having a hard time feeling isolated, you're feeling lonely, or maybe you're having a hard time trusting God's plan, that it's really gonna pan out the way that he told you it would. Would you raise your hand and I can pray for you? If you'd like, you can come forward. The altar is open, and someone will come and pray for you. But I just want to pray right now for us, that we would have the thought process to know and to trust that he's going to carry out his plan, no matter where we might be in the process. So God, we just thank you today. We thank you for your presence here. We thank you for your presence in our lives. We ask you to show yourself faithful in the little things. God, we ask you to help us to trust you, that you know what you're doing. Give us that thought process, God, that we know that you know what you're doing. Even when it seems like the lions are about ready to attack. When we're down in a well, we know that the dream you had given us is still going to come to pass. God, give us a revelation of who you are, a fresh revelation of who you are. Help us to walk that out in our lives and in our thoughts, in our minds. God, we thank you for being faithful and true to finish the work that you began in us, that you will bring it about to completion. We thank you so much for meeting us where we are. In Jesus' name.